Yes. Good afternoon to one and all. Welcome to another Astor B. Watt lunchtime lecture. We've been having quite a successful time over the last couple months as we restarted the lectures. And we've had quite a cadre of excellent speakers at this lunchtime lecture. Today, it's no different. We have a very high caliber speaker for you, and we are inviting you to send out the link and invite as many persons as possible to view today's presentation. We had the privilege of having, as I said, some of the leading thought leaders in respect to the different sectors in Barbados, whether politics, finance, child law, etc. And we continue to celebrate the initiative of the Astor B. Watts Lecture. The intent was always to have a community of Democratic Labour Party persons coming together, and friends of the Democratic Labour Party and thought leaders in one place where we can discuss matters occurring in Barbados. And we are certainly happy with what we're seeing so far. We're seeing the news reports and all that's happening from those news reports. So without further ado, it is my distinct honor to to introduce Professor Justin Robinson. He is a recipient of the Vice Chancellor Award for Public Service at the University of the West Indies. Professor Robinson has specialities in the area of capital markets in developing countries, public finance, financial management, corporate finance, and these are, to name a few. He obviously was born in a beautiful island and is a resident of Barbados, and is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. He also lectures in the Department of Management Studies in the area of financial management. Professor Robinson obtained his PhD in finance from the University of Manchester, United Kingdom. Professor Robinson currently serves as a director of the Central Bank of Barbados, a director of Barbados Independence Film Festival, vice president of the Barbados Museum, and certainly is a member of a credit rating body called the CARI-CRIS. He was formerly the chairman of the National Insurance Scheme. I can go on reading his accolades, as he is an active academic and certainly a luminary in our eyes, and we want to encourage you to listen very keenly to what he has to share today. Make him feel welcome, Professor Justin Robinson. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. We're still trying to get the projection. See the brother here trying something else. Yeah. Changing the device. Okay, good. We're in business. Okay, so good afternoon. Always a pleasure. I cannot believe that it's so long that my friends in the DLP have not invited me to give a lecture here. But I won't take it personal, as I know I am among the dare-loving people. It is always a pleasure for me to give a lecture under the title of Astor Watts. You know, Astor was a very special person to me and it started out for an interesting reason, because my mother's father, I was born in St. Vincent, my mother's father is Barbadian, and Astor was actually the only person other than my late grandfather's sister who I ever met in Barbados who knew him as a person, you know, so that was always very special to me. So again, the memory of Astor. And as I look around, it's with a little tinge of sadness, because, you know, I Friday evening here, Tennyson, Besley, that was sort of my crowd. We would come to the lecture, have lunch, and we wouldn't leave until it was dark. So to those dearly departed. So I'm going to do a brief lecture, and hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation around some issues. Okay, so I'm going to take you into school. We're going to start. Again, so we're talking about the financial system. So we like to think that there is that fundamental economic problem that is always confronted. It could be an individual, a family, a business, an organization like the DLP, or a government. The basic economic problem we're talking about is what we call a mismatch between your desired expenditure and your income plus your wealth. In everyday terms, it's something we all experience, the difference between what you would like to spend, your desired expenditure, and how much you have, which is your income or a salary plus any savings. So that there's always a sort of very basic, fundamental economic problem at different levels, whether an individual, a household, a business, an organization like DLP, and a government, that these things don't often line up. So economists like to put these units into maybe 3 buckets. So one is a state that most of us would be very unfamiliar with, what we call a balanced budget unit, where the amount you would like to spend is pretty much what you have. So you're good. You don't have anything to worry about. The government would like to spend $2 billion for the year, and the tax revenues, everything coming in is roughly $2 billion, so you don't have anything to worry about. Now in the economy, most of the players find themselves in one of the other 2 buckets. If you're like me and you're an academic teacher all your life, then you end up being what we call a deficit budget unit, where in simpler terms, the amount you would like to spend is more than you have. Okay, your desired expenditure is greater than your salary or income coming in plus your savings. So you have a shortage of money. And there's some other players who are, on the flip side, surplus units. Their income plus their wealth is greater than the amount they would like to spend. They have extra money. So the economic problem comes across because of these two groups of people, or players in the economy. Some have a shortage of money, some have a surplus of money. And what is the basic role of the financial system? The basic role of the financial system is to move money between these 2 units. So you have somebody who retired from a big company and they get a big gratuity. They have a lot of money on the bank. They already pay off their mortgage, etc. They have extra money. You have a young family just starting out. They're trying to get house, land, and everything. They need extra money. And the basic role of the financial system is to move money between these 2 units. And we in finance tend to think that this is a very important function. And as I look around this group, I think some people here are old enough to remember, because you know, debt and borrowing has a bad name to some extent. But I want us to pause a little bit and think, what if every player in the economy, households, businesses, organizations, governments, if everybody had to be a balanced budget unit, what would that mean for the quality of life? It would, so again, think of it simply. In terms of getting a house, what would that mean? You would have to wait until you saved up enough money to buy your house and land for cash. What would that mean in terms of getting a car? Or even more basic things that we take for granted, the school children going to school. How does this play out? The teachers are there, right, and others, and they have to be paid every month. That wage bill is due every month. How does the government get money? Does it collect tax revenues every month? So in a given month, the cost of running the government of Barbados might be $10 million. If the government was a balanced budget unit, it meant that they would have to earn revenue of $10 million every month. But does it really work like that in practice? People file their VAT every quarter. Money comes in, bridge these gaps. So I wanted to make that point to introduce sort of my main topic in a way, because there's a bit of a negative conversation in the country around mash you up, but it can hurt you quite bad. To think in a way, what are the consequences of in every period of time must be exactly equal to how much you are earning plus your savings, and the life implications of that are very different. So I want to put some numbers in front of you here, and I think it's important. Players in a political party, for example, these are numbers that people should be very familiar with to try to bring some concreteness at the level of government to what I'm saying. So in the year 2009, the 2009-2010 financial year, the government of Barbados collected $2.4 billion in revenue. That's what the government collected in revenue. And in 2009, the government spent $3.4 billion. So that's an example of what we mean by a deficit budget unit. The amount of spend is greater than what is coming in. 2018, the government collected $3 billion roughly in revenue, spent $4.4 billion. 2019, collected $3 billion, spent $3.1. 2020, collected $3 billion, spent $3.3. 2021, collected $2.5 billion, spent $3.4. And for 2022, projected, it's expected to collect 2. So one of the points I wanted people to come away with is that second line, the expenditure. The government of Barbados, as we know it, it needs at least $3 billion a year to run the government of Barbados as we know it. If you go across those numbers, in none of these years has the government of Barbados spent less than $3 billion. And maybe the number to run the government of Barbados is really more in the vicinity of $3.5 billion. That's to pay the salaries, all of the services, and so on. Now, also to kind of make the point I was trying to make earlier about what if there was no financial system? What would that mean? I want you to pause and think about that. If the government couldn't access borrowing from somewhere, what would it mean? It would mean that this year, financial year, the government could only spend $2.8 billion. Now, all of the expenses of the government that have been budgeted for, things that we know we have to pay for in this financial year, are expected to cost $3.6 billion. So if there was no way to borrow or raise money, it means the government would have to limit its spending to $2.8 billion. How would that happen? What would be the implications of that? You won't be able to do a lot of things. It'll be lost of jobs. So it is possible. So I kind of pose the question, what if individuals, household, businesses, what if you were forced to be balanced budget units? What would that mean? Either you have to find some new sources of revenue, you have to cut some things that you are spending money on, or some combination of the two. And I don't think either of those are easy or pleasant to do, because we have a way that we always think that spending on something that is not important to us is wastage. But what is not important to you may very well be very important to somebody else. So I always find those arguments, you really end up passing the buck. So again, I wanted to leave people in a way with a fact, a sort of a fact, a reality in their mind as one key thing, that the modern government of Barbados costs somewhere around $3.5 billion at least a year for us to run that government, and that money has to come from somewhere. So I think as we have the conversation around debt and borrowing, we want to keep that context in mind, that if we can't raise money through the financial markets, then it means the government spending is going to be strictly limited to how much revenue that the government can raise. Okay, and so this is how we sort of think and that's the role of the financial system. You can think some people are short of money. These are the people here, the deficit unit. Some people have extra money. And the purpose of the financial system is to move these extra funds over on this side so that people can smooth and match up their spending. So again, think of it very simply. Somebody is 18. They want to go to university. They have no money. They are a deficit unit. But the university degree costs $20,000. What are they supposed to do? If they have to be a balanced budget unit, what does that mean? Either they have mother, father, somebody who can give them $20,000, or they have to access it from somewhere. But the degree might give them a job that they can earn. They can become a doctor, make big money, and pay that back and live a good life. But if they can't access that money at that point, they never have that opportunity. So again, just to reiterate the point that if we don't have a financial system to move money between those who have surpluses and those who are short, then you're dealing with a very different type of world. I mean, I am old enough to remember as a boy growing up in St. Vincent, only a few people had things in their house when I was growing up. People getting furniture, basic things. I mean, only a few people had really good stuff. I mean, I could remember the two people in my village who had a car. And it was the two families who had a car. And again, I think a key part of that is at that time, the financial system was very underdeveloped. People's ability to access credit and so on was limited, so you had to really work within that. Now, I'm not making a case for going crazy on credit, but I'm saying access to financing is quite important. Otherwise, how much you spend is limited to what you have, and that doesn't always work. Now, I'm also coming to what I think is maybe the second and hopefully more important part of what I'm trying to say. Now, that $3.6 billion that the government is supposed to spend this year, that is just to pay bills. I want us to keep that in mind. That you're not putting aside anything for a rainy day. There's no emergency. That is just, so if you think of it in household terms, that is just to pay mortgage, loans, credit card, light, water, things that you have to pay. I mean, that's just the bare essentials. That don't give you no wiggle room to do anything. Now, one of the things I want to argue that countries like Barbados and a lot of the Caribbean, we are in a very interesting position. I guess so globally, we are classified as what you call middle-income countries. Most Caribbean countries are classified as middle-income countries. I guess if you think of it in a colloquial sense, we are classified as middle class. You're not rich. You're sort of not poor. So we are put in that middle income bracket. And in a sense, so and I say that's a good part of the Caribbean story, that we don't, we sometimes are very hard on ourselves, but since independence and coming from, most Caribbean countries have been able to achieve that middle income status, because at the end of my diagram here, this is the amount of income that make you a lower middle income, and most of our Caribbean countries are above that. We are well in the middle income category, and you have places like Bahamas, St. Kitts, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Antigua, that are really very much seen as even being in the upper middle income group. So there has been that element of success that we have achieved, pulling ourselves up from the poverty, really, of the if you sort of reference the 1930s, the state of the Caribbean, pulling ourselves up to this point. So I think that's a very positive part of the story. The maybe negative or the challenging part, which I suppose as an academic I sort of spend a lot of time now thinking and worry and go through these issues, is really something of a challenge around economic growth. And I have some numbers here looking at the 1981 to 2021 period. So that's a 41-year period. And if we look at that, what do we see? Between 1981 and 1921, the Singapore economy grew by about 248% over that period. So doubled, about 2.5 times the size. And we often use Singapore as a sort of reference point. It's a small island, became independent about the same time as most Caribbean countries, and their first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, was at London School of Economics with Errol Barrow and a couple of others. And he once famously said that if he had a country the size of Jamaica to run, he would do wonders. So it's always been a reference point. Again, closer to home, you have the Dominican Republic. In that period, their economy has grown by 180%. Mauritius is often another reference point that we use. It's a small island off Africa, very similar history to us, colonial history and so on. They have grown by 171%, and we have it coming down there. And Barbados, we have grown by a combined 22% over that period. So it's either that we have kind of gotten well off, but getting beyond that has proven a challenge. I mean, I don't know how many people here are like football fans, but I think of it like the English Premiership is that you've gotten into the Premiership as a team, but you really are struggling to challenge for the top 10 places. We are kind of stuck there. Now, what I think is part of the problem story I'm building is if you look at those years, if you look at the number of years where the economy grew. So for those 41 years in Singapore, the economy grew for 37 of those years and declined in 4 of those years. When you come to our region, again, Trinidad, we think of as a relatively well-off economy. For those 41 years, Trinidad had growth in 26 of those years, but 15 years of decline. Similarly, Barbados, Jamaica, 30 years of positive growth, but 11 years of decline. So one of the things we see in our region is that even though we are middle income, we tend to have more years where we have GDP declines. Now I want to take a closer look at that. Okay, before that. So again, what are the causes? And we could debate that back and forth, and I guess I'll come back to that. And so my argument is, I can't dignify it with the name theory yet, but what I'm sort of proposing, and looking at Barbados, what do we see here? So over the 1961 to 2021 period, So from 61, the Barbados economy would have grown by 112%, so doubled. But if you sort of break that down into some periods, and I'm trying a kind of periodization here as I understand it, 1961 to 73 was our glory period. So from that 61 to 73 period, the economy grew by 74.2%. I mean, again, I think that is extremely important. Because if you think of, we've gotten to that middle income status, but almost 3/4 of that growth, that wealth creation happened in the 61 to 73 period. You know, we had that transition, modernized, and so on. And this kind of story I'm trying to tell, which I think is the story of our economy and how we might, and most Caribbean countries. Now, 1974 to 75, those years combined, the economy fell by 6.6%. What happened there? First oil crisis. So if young people now think that the spike in gas from the Ukraine war is serious, people can remember the days of the privilege pump and all of that drama back. We then had, so one of the stories that I'm trying to tell here really is we are very vulnerable to external shocks. And it's something that we always know. You know, I sort of grew up hearing people say when the US catch a cold, we get pneumonia, etc. So we're very vulnerable. So that shock hit us, and it sort of takes us 2 years to recover. And then we have another growth spurt, 1976 to 1980, where the economy grew by 25%. So again, that's pretty solid. Then 80, 81, second oil shock. Economy goes back into recession, and we lose 6.8%. It kind of takes us again 2 years to bounce back from that. Then we have another long period where the external environment is kind to us. And 83 to 89, the economy grows by about 20% in that period. 1991, what happened in 1991? Gulf War I, that first shock. And the economy declines between the 1990 to 92 period, declining by 12.9%. And in a way, this kind of shows, I think it's an introduction to the argument I'm trying to make. Between 83 and 89, how much growth did we pile up? How many points did we rack up between 83 and 89? 20%, right? But between 1990 and 92, with that shock, we lost more than half of it. You know, so it's almost, who was that? Was Serenada, one step forward. That's, in a way, a version of that we grow and then the external shock pulls us back. 1993 to 2000, again, a period of strong growth, 22%. 2001, what happens in 2001? 9/11, World Trade Center bombing, and we lose 2.3% of GDP coming out of that. 2002 to 2008, period of solid growth again, 17.1%. 2009 to 2019, we have what I call a sort of local debt crisis, and we lose 5.3%. So the economy is more flat than in crisis. And then the real big McGuffey, as they say, 2020, COVID-19, and we lose 14% of GDP coming out of that pandemic. And why did I take you through a lot of that financing point? Because again, I think in terms of the debate we are having and some of the things around the country, I think we are missing potentially an important point. These same shocks that are affecting us, a lot of them, and Barbados has been fortunate, you know, we haven't had a Hurricane Ivan or somebody hit us and we lose so much of GDP. So if I were to do this and work through this for a Dominica or a Grenada, you would have But these shocks here, a lot of these are international shocks. They're coming out of advanced countries which are also suffering those shocks. However, they are not taking as long to recover as us. And why? Again, because they have, I guess, what economists call buffers. But buffers in everyday terms, really, they have savings, they have access to money. So the US, UK, Japan, China, when they get hit with these crises, the loss in GDP tends to be smaller, and they rebound from the crisis faster because their governments have the ability to intervene with what economists call counter-cyclical policies. So economists use the fancy term counter-cyclical. The economy is going down. What does the government try to do? Go in the opposite direction by spending more money. Now, you could be what we call pro-cyclical, the economy going down and the government has to cut spending. And one of my arguments is because we don't have access to financing, we end up having to do that and make the whole worse. So I have some figures here from the response in advanced countries to the COVID-19 pandemic. In response to so that same GDP loss that we are getting there, 14% from the pandemic. The US was hit by the pandemic, their GDP fell, but why wasn't the effect as great? One is that their government was able to respond by pumping an overwhelming amount of money into the economy to shore it up. So, and this is an underestimate, because when I first did this article, that number is a number I had traced in March of 2020, where the US had a spending package of about $1 trillion, 5% of their GDP that they were going to pump into their economy in response to that. In the Eurozone, 27 billion euros is what they were pumping in. In Japan, 30 trillion yen. And this is just what the government is doing. And in addition to what the government is doing, they have central banks that are able to pump tremendous amounts of liquidity into their economy. So in everyday terms then, what is the big difference? The shock hits you. If you are an advanced country and you have buffers, you have savings, and also you have access to financing, what can you do in response to that shock? The patient is weak, so what do? You can pump the patient up with a set of drugs, give him he or she what they need that they can recover. Now, if you are in the Caribbean, what happens when these crises hit? We have to go pro-cyclical. Because we don't have the buffers, we don't have the savings, and we don't have access to the financing, we actually have to cut spending in many cases at the precise time when the standard economic medicine is that the government should be spending more to go counter-cyclical. So my argument is that because of the absence of buffers, which are really savings, and the lack of access to cheap financing, when Caribbean countries get hit by a shock, the effect on GDP is larger than in advanced countries, and the time to recover is much slower. So when we look at, people sort of look at, when people look at this chart, and I read an article in the newspaper, I think, where I had put that some people sort of take it almost as a criticism, where you're saying, oh, Barbados at the bottom, Caribbean at the bottom. But I don't look at it through those, and that's not the argument I'm trying to make. Because the question I want to get to, what if we had the buffers to do the appropriate response at the time of these crises? Why are we at the bottom in terms of that cumulative growth? My argument is because we don't have the buffers, we don't have access to the financing, the gains we build up, which I'm trying to make in a simple way on this chart, the gains we build up in good years get rapidly undermined whenever there is a shock. And the shocks are inevitable, given the way we are. We are especially vulnerable to these shocks. And again, that's something I really want us to internalize the vulnerability. That hurricane that just hit in the U.S., what's that, Ian? I mean, that's like a hugely devastating storm. I'm going to bet you that the effect of that storm is going to have no effect whatsoever on the GDP of the United States. It's a massive storm, does massive destruction, but in terms of that part of the U.S. and their share of the U.S. GDP, the U.S. economy is not even, it's going to be like if you stump your toe and you get a little prick and you move on. Now, a storm like that now hits a Caribbean country. What's the difference? Okay, so we are uniquely vulnerable. So again, going back to where I started, what is our financing challenge? We don't have enough revenue just to pay our bills. So remember, that estimated expenditure line is just to pay normal bills. So we need financing to close just that gap. But what about the ability to build buffers, the ability to respond to shocks? So that's where I'm arguing that the access to financing is extremely important, because if we don't have these buffers, if we don't have this ability to respond to shocks, then it's really the Serenada scenario we're in. That whatever you build up is going to get wiped out quite fast. So I'm thinking the scale of financing that is required to respond to crises requires that Barbados and other Caribbean countries have access to the resources of what we call the multilateral system, World Bank and others, on concessionary terms. Because the scale of financing to respond to a shock, we're not talking 50 million. You're actually talking large amounts of money. If you are to get hit by a major hurricane, something like the COVID-19 pandemic, transitioning in terms of adapting to climate change, I mean, that's a massively expensive project. If we were to move to having no fossil fuel in our economy, that's a big ambition by 2030. What are the costs of that to Barbados? I mean, what's the cost of that to, say, the government of Barbados? Because that's something we haven't heard a lot of discussion about. Because the government makes a lot of money taxing fossil fuel. If we move to an economy that we are not using fossil fuel, that's a chunk of money out of the government's revenue. How is that going to be made up? But people argue it's a transition we have to make. If you have these larger, more frequent storms, then you're going to have to build differently. So climate change, adaptation, mitigation, we are really talking hundreds of millions of dollars that our countries are going to have to access. And that scale of financing means that we have to have access to large amounts of money at concessionary terms. Because if we were to borrow them at commercial terms, then it certainly would be a challenge. Now, in terms of our access to foreign financing on this bill, which I probably can't see very well, hope you can see it better than I can. The foreign financing we've been accessing over the years has been relatively small. 2009, 290 million. 2018, 83 million. 2019, 190 million. 2020, 265. 2021, 447 million. 2022, 466. So the share of foreign is increasing. But in terms of the scale of the financing needs for us to be able to build buffers, to have savings, and you know, the term buffer sounds abstract, but what happened? I think COVID brought these things down very real. You have a pandemic. To protect health, you say people have to stay home. You have to social distance. It means a whole set of people can't go out to work. So that's a chunk of, those people can't earn an income. So what do? Who supports them? Now, in the US, Japan, Canada, the government had the wherewithal to send people checks. I mean, in the US, people were getting checks just to keep themselves going. How do you make the investments in healthcare? How do you pay for the vaccines? And so on. And in terms of foreign financing, the sources we are getting from IDB is really stepped up in a major way. The European Investment Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, IMF, well, CDB, we could call that foreign, and an increasing role to some extent for China. So now there is this thing called, what we call them the international financial institutions or the multilateral system. So after World War II, the governments around the world set up a set of financial institutions, and one of their functions is really to move savings and move funds around the world so that people can have access. And there's a whole setup of this. There's the IMF, there's the World Bank Group, or what we call the World, so there's no such thing really as a World Bank, there's the group. And then there are a lot of multi-regional banks, so the European Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, IADB, and all of these are really modeled to some extent on the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is in the World Bank, and so on. So these really are the institutions that leaders around the world, in their wisdom, would have set up as a means of ensuring that countries around the world could have access to the financing and the expertise. And one of the big questions of the day really, are these institutions really still fit for purpose? And are they playing the role that they are supposed to play in terms of facilitating that movement of funds around the world? Because so did the multilateral system really envisage a world where countries would be in such different situations, where you're faced with a pandemic and one government can put $1 trillion to help its people get through, another government, hundreds of millions, but you have a set of people around the world, countries who are members of this system, whose governments end up actually having to go the other way sometimes and cut their spending. So are these institutions really playing their role? You know, within the World Bank, there are a whole, again, the World Bank Group, a whole set of institutions. And one of the key elements tying my story together, I hope, is that because a number of us have achieved that middle income status, the terms and conditions that we can borrow money from these institutions are relatively strict. They are not concessionary. So they are not market rates as if you go on the open market, but this is not necessarily concessionary money. So if you are among the very poorest countries in the world, you can get your money through something like the International Development Association if you don't have money. You can get money from IDA. And these are normally a loan that you get that you have 40 years to repay. Interest rates 1% or less. You have a 10-year grace period before you start paying it back. So that's what I mean by concessionary terms. But because we are middle income, we are often unable to access the financing at those terms. So even though the institutions are there, there is this gap in the financial system for middle-income countries because the terms and conditions that we can access the money under are simply not palatable or really practical for our countries. So again, just to reiterate, I mean, one of the key points I wanted to make is that the scale of money that vulnerable developing countries like ourselves require to respond to crises, to build buffers, to make the transition to a more zero carbon economy, climate change, that we need to have access to the resources of the multilateral system at concessionary terms. So in bringing this brief thing to a close, so what I would say is my diagnosis, that we are small, open economies. We are dependent on international trade. You have the COVID-19 pandemic, nobody is traveling, the economy virtually shut down. The monkeys take over the hotels. We all saw these. We saw this on social media. You know, you have a shock in the supply chain. What does it mean? It means that something happened to your car. You can't get the parts. You can't get goods. So we are very vulnerable to what happens externally. So whenever there's an external shock, it sort of feeds into our economy. It affects the way the economy works. We call that aggregate demand, and also critically our foreign exchange. And then the fiscal problem is what I said. Now I think you have these shocks. I think they're inevitable because of who we are, small islands. We can't change, we can't suddenly become a continent, or, that's our geography. But because we don't have access to the to the money, when this shock hits, we are often forced to go pro-cyclical and cut spending, which makes the shock even worse, and we take longer to recover. So our growth trajectory, our ability to grow, is frequently undermined by these, but when you have these shocks and you have to make these fiscal adjustments because of an external shock, or any domestic slackness where we create our own fiscal imbalances. So how do we, again, to summarize, I would argue that external shocks are inevitable given the nature of our economies. But what if we could do two things? What if we could avoid homegrown fiscal crises? What if we could manage our own financial affairs in a manner that we don't have these fiscal crises, and also have buffers to avoid growth-destroying and painful fiscal adjustment programs? Because, again, part of my thesis is that the reason our growth has underperformed is because we are vulnerable to these external shocks. And whenever we have a fiscal crisis arising either from domestic causes or because of the shock, because we don't have access to the financing or the buffers, we are forced to make further cuts, which actually destroy the growth that we've built up. So external shocks are inevitable. We can't do anything about that. How do we manage external shocks? We need to have buffers, access to financing. But we also need to take care of our business at home and avoid homegrown fiscal crises where we create unsustainable deficits and so on. So external shocks, I argue, are inevitable, but where would our growth be if we could avoid homegrown fiscal crises and build buffers to avoid growth-destroying and painful fiscal adjustment programs, which have been features of all of those periods that I'm talking about there. These down periods, a lot of that is the external shock or the homegrown fiscal crisis has been exacerbated by having to do fiscal adjustment, having to do austerity. And I think key things, we need strong fiscal and financial management rules to ensure that we build up buffers of domestic money, build up foreign exchange buffers, that we have access to capital markets. And the access to capital markets is important. We can't do it all on our own. As well as we manage our domestic finances, we are never going to be able to build up the size of buffers that we need to respond to crises and to fund the transition. And I think one of the big questions is that quite often we've had that fiscal discipline only when we've been in IMF programs. So when you when you're driving with the driving instructor, people drive very well. But when they have to drive on their own, then you get all the bad habits, and I think that's really a key policy question. And it's important, I think, to really engaging the global financial system. Said access to financing is critical to managing a modern state with a developmental agenda while facing an impending climate crisis. And again, I think that's one of the more important points I want to make, because we are having a conversation about debt and borrowing, etc. But if you are a developmental state where you are trying to provide persons with access to high quality education and opportunities, health care, social services, you are a developmental state and you are facing a climate crisis, then you need access to that financing. I don't think we can get that financing domestically. I think that financing that needs require access to multilateral money at concessionary terms. And I think locally, I really want to encourage three things: that we need to have the knowledge of the scale of the finance needed and the range of financing options. I find that is missing from some of the local debate. What is the scale of financing that we actually need to, one, run the government, build some buffers, which is putting in some money for a rainy day, and funding some of the transitions that we need to make. I don't think we have a discussion really. Enough people are clear as to what are the needs, and then what are the options to get this money. Then I think we need to have the knowledge and the mindset to engage the global financial system where that money is and negotiate for terms and conditions that are to our advantage, and to engage in strong advocacy and form partnerships, really, to influence and shape the global agenda. We are just not passive voices. One of the advantages that opposition parties have is that not being caught up in the hurly-burly of everyday government is that opposition parties actually have time to sit back and reflect on these issues, build up that knowledge and expertise, and really, if they get into government, or to make a case for government based on that knowledge and expertise. So that's really, in a way, my advice, encouragement, that one of the benefits of time in opposition is time to reflect, look back, apprise yourself of the issues, build up that knowledge about the challenges and the possible solutions. And the ending slide is meaningless, but I just like the picture. So thank you. So any questions, comments? I see my good buddy George. Read there.
George.
I know he's going to have some tough questions.
No. I really got to apologize because I have to leave.
Right.
No, I thought that the lecture will start at 1 o'clock. And I left my wife at the dentist to go and buy a newspaper.
Happy wife, happy life, so you should.
Right, you got the point. But my point, of course, is that you and I have agreed to sit down and talk to each other. And I've written a few things recently in the press and so on.
Yes, I've noted those.
Yes. My point, though, is... Sorry. My point is that I have a question and I have an observation. How many of the present cabinet have you lectured to at KFL? Yeah. No, I'm serious about this.
No. I can think of.
Okay.
Humphrey is one of my students.
No, but the other point is this. I think that the kind of things you're saying to us, there should be capacity or arrangement that, and this is really to the people who are not here. When a new government of people who are neophytes, greenhorns, and inexperienced comes to government, without the point that you're making about the capacity when in opposition to think through what you would do when you get to the government, and that applies to both parties. You come without any framework, without any understanding of what you're going to do, and you jump in at the middle, and you start to drown. Now, the point about it is that there ought to be some arrangement whereby new people can be exposed to the kind of discussions that we have here right now. Okay? And yes, but politics being what it is, and there's a belief that when you become a politician, no, not that you know everything, but you don't. But it would be a step down if you were prepared to asking somebody who knows better than you, how should they do, what can they do?
But this is, in some ways, I mean, I've lived in Barbados for a long time, and this is certainly a unique feature for the DLP that you have something like this, which is a non-partisan lecture. I mean, I've come to lectures here where people have come and cursed the government.
Yeah, right.
So it's actually quite good that you know there's a forum where you can just come and speak. I think that's very important.
Yeah, but I want to make one comment about something you said. But having been there, I spent 12 years in Washington between World Bank, IDB, and so on. I also was involved between 91 and 96 with the IMF on the other side and so on. Now, the problem for small countries is that resources, not just financial resources, but human beings, the warm bodies who move the resources, are in a sense limited. And the problem of graduation and all of that, and I went through that, is that it's a rationing process. And it is very, very difficult when you are there. And people say, but Barbados is so well off, look at it. When you see people who are really poor, when you deal with real poverty, you know, and Haiti is a prime example in our hemisphere, to really make the kind of case that we would need better terms. So it's a question of rationing.
No, I agree.
And that's the real difficulty.
That's why I kind of make the point about the advocacy shaping the global debate around our way, because we have a lot of fear of these institutions, but they also want successes, huh?
Yes.
There are humans in these organizations. They want successes, and in some ways, they struggle for their own relevance.
And Barbados has been a success.
Exactly, they need success.
You see, that's the problem. Barbados was a success in the period 80 to, let's say, to 80, 88 and so on. And if you are a success, they will want to then you. But then that creates a problem because it's competition. I gotta go.
Yes, happy wife. Don't get any trouble.
She was first.
Right, thank you. I'm going to just ask a simple question. No academics in it, in a real way, that persons have been asking. I understand your whole dialogue here this evening, this afternoon. But one of the questions that we are asking out there as normal, everyday persons, we understand the external shocks and all of that would happen to countries like ours. But what is it when we go to the financial systems and all that and we get money? You hear about this money that we've borrowed and all that. What is it that we are using according to what is happening out there to your political, what I write here, upgrading your political friends and all that? Where that lot of money going that we cannot understand why. Yes, we know we have to borrow. We know then that we will have to get these buffers and all that. Okay, but how is it spent? And I think that you need to deal in a way with how the money should really be spent and how it should not be wasted on what we call political upgrades with your political friends. And to me, that is one of the simple things out there that are affecting persons questioning about how Barbados as a, well, if you call it a small open economy, how we are going to survive. If this continues from one like generation of what governments or whatever to the other. And some are worse in doing the political friends than others. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so that's an interesting question. So the way I would think about that is, so we are kind of you're raising a question around maybe this expenditure line and how governments decide what they spend on from what they collect. And I think, again, priorities are where you choose to spend. And that's why I often think, it's really important that John Public engage in a place like Barbados or with the education level, engage simple documents like parts of the estimates, where you see where money is supposed to spend, and that the public can have a meaningful debate and discussion, because that's the only thing that leads politicians to change their priorities, when they think they're going to lose votes. So where the public sees money spending in ways it shouldn't, then the public needs to agitate around that, because that's a political decision that is only going to be affected by political pressure. And political pressure really has to come from the masses saying, we don't want our money spent A, B, C, D way.
Good afternoon, sir. I have a question or two here to ask you. You outlined from 1961 to 1973 the economy underneath Barra, the growth, and I stop at 1973 because I know you went right down to 2022. But this is in this period I want to ask him this question. And successful government down, the growth and the successful government down to 2022. I have it here, Mr. Allen, Dr. Allen, government. If under the Barra government and the other successful government, I guess you mean Tom Adams, Sandiford, Bree St. John, right down to now, that they had used the Singapore model to grow the economy of Barbados. What model are the Prime Minister of Barbados is using? That's the first question. The second one is, I have to look good. I don't have my papers there. All right. I will ask the second one out of my head because I've written it.
Okay.
All right. How do you see Barbados in a time like this, when we have strong trading ties with Britain, and the pound has dropped, and the government of Britain in these times are very, very unstable? How do you see Barbados in the coming future?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So it's quite possible, and I know I kind of set up one of my colleagues years ago. You see, it's quite possible to put this table and do it by political administration. And you certainly can get a political administration story in there. My own sense is that there's enough to go around, that both sides have their fair share of ups and downs, so I think it evens out. I mean, if I have to be frank, I don't think we ever followed Singapore model. I think it was just a useful reference point or a phrase, because Singapore is about the size of St. Lucia. It was a British colony, speak English mainly, became independent at the same time. But we never really followed a Singapore model. I think the story is more complicated as well. Singapore is in a so when you look at growth, one of the things the economists look at, how you grow or your growth rates is also influenced by the neighborhood you live in. Singapore is in a very different neighborhood. Singapore is in Southeast Asia, which has been the fastest growing region in the world for the last 20 years. Our neighborhood has not exactly been the fastest growing. And I no longer use Singapore as a reference point, because in my view, Singapore, to put it colloquially, Singapore went and left us a long time ago. They are almost in a different category. What model are we following now? So that's an interesting. So the way I read this pattern, I think about it, is beginning in the 60s, we built a modern Barbados economy. You had a lot of there was a lot of investment in physical infrastructure. We had the airport, the port, modern highways, and we got some growth from that. We invested a lot of money in human capital, healthcare, education, and we built out a modern tourism industry. And we also built the international business sector. So my sort of simple read is that has taken us to a certain point. And we are kind of at a point now where we are looking for what I call new growth catalysts. What is the next? So it's like if you sort of beat everybody with 4 fast bowlers. But everybody has gone into the nets, and people can back pace, etc. So what is it that you're going to do differently to sort of get you winning again? I think that's the kind of point we are at, where we got rich, or we got middle income status on those investments. But what is the next sort of wind beneath our sails? Is it cryptocurrencies like my friend Hal here? Is it some other thing that is going to drive us? The UK matter. Okay, so the UK is an important country in terms of what people call soft power, in that they speak English, the dominant language in the world, and they have the monarch and the football league. But the UK is actually not that important an economy in the world anymore. I mean, the pound is something like 5% or less of global currency trading. But the UK is an important partner for us in terms of tourism. They account for about 51% of our tourist arrivals. So in terms of what's happening now, I think the effect would depend on if you have a sustained drop in the value of the pound. Because something happens, financial markets react, but people choose their holidays. I mean, a lot of these decisions are made with a long term, they're booked in advance. So if there's a sustained decline in the value of the pound, then it certainly could affect the spend for tourists here when they come. Everything will cost a lot more on arrivals. And also maybe some of our local, we do have a population here who rely on pensions and other things coming out of the UK, so those could be affected. But my own sense is that the UK has strong institutions, and they will get through this, and I expect the pound to rebound.
Hi.
Hold me to that forecast.
Hi, good afternoon, Justin. This is more a statement and a comment to assist when you were just speaking of the Singapore model. If the audience could forgive me, I had a dental appointment this morning, so I can't feel anything beyond here. So if I sound a bit slurred or whatever, that's the reason. I promise I won't verbal on the mic. But people like to tout the Singapore model. And in my area of discipline in political economy, a key factor that many persons don't bring into play in terms of things like the Singapore model is that at its stage of development, Singapore was almost effectively a dictatorship. All right? Under Lee Kuan Yew, I think it was. And that has been a debate that has challenged development economists and political economists for many years. Whether you will have democracy and growth going hand in hand, or dictatorship and growth. Popular democracies allow for dissent in policies and programs and so on. If you look at the development of many of the very successful countries today. South Korea, Brazil, the big industrialized countries, well, they're big, but they became industrialized and much of the development took place there. Argentina, with Pinochet, all right? You see in Singapore, they actually, at those periods, they were under military dictatorships and so on. So that when the government took a particular policy line, or said, look, this is the road that we're going down, and you have to have leaders with certain visions and prepared to enforce them. You didn't have that sort of popular dissent that you can have, for example, in the media and so on and so forth. All right? Justin, persons like you won't get a chance up here, so on. You might disappear sometime in the middle of the night. All right? And it's only really after those countries built a particular base that they then transition and democratize in many instances. I am extremely concerned in relation to Barbados. And this is not a problem that this current administration will only face. This is a serious problem that any future administration in Barbados will face. And that is what will be our new platform of growth and development. I don't know how you all feel about it, but in terms of tourism, in my own view, I may be a bit harsh, but Barbados' tourism product to me is stale. It is stale. It is now developed, it is peaked, it is plateaued. And new and cheaper places that offering different experiences are things. So that's why you'll see Grenada, Antigua, these places seriously taking off. They're offering something different. Tourism being our main engine of economic growth, I don't think that the last administration they made much headway, if any at all, in terms of the international. No, it's not a question, it's a comment, I just said. The last administration didn't make any headway in terms of international business. And this current administration is not making that. So Justin, I don't know if you, in your own way, can see on the horizon what will be the new platform of growth, competitive growth for a country like Barbados. I'm having some difficulty in identifying that. I will admit that to you.
Yeah, that's the big one, you know. What are the sort of new growth catalysts? I mean, one area that comes to mind is how you turn a problem into an opportunity. This whole transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to being more resilient, mitigation, adaptation. I think there's some opportunities there as you seek to transition, because again, the international community seems more willing to fund those kinds of things, so you can get financing there. So that, I mean, that's a significant new build out. So I certainly see an opportunity there because it is urgent and there is access to money for it. Again, digitization, again, I think through that's where you can get money, again, to finance projects around digitization. But there is no magic bullet. And with tourism, my view is that I don't think tourism should decline in relative terms. Not that we want to make tourism smaller, but we want other new industries and other things to rise to supplement it. But I don't have the answer to that at all.
Hi. Yeah, good afternoon, Justin. I'm going to be very brief. I don't know if you got to UE last evening. If you didn't, you would have heard the Fenty a cappella sisters singing fantastic. You would have heard a chap by the name of Husbands on the saxophone. Absolutely brilliant. I don't know if you got to the Marcus Garvey lecture to hear Tavon Boyce singing Redemption Song. Point is that Cindy and all these young artists, fantastic artists that we are creating, when they go and ask Mr. Husbands, do you know what an NFT is? A non-fungible token? He doesn't have a clue. So I said, well, you know what an NFT is? It's an opportunity for you to digitize your fantastic work, put it on a global market, and make some money, right? There's a company called MicroStrategy, which you probably not have heard of. Back in February 2020, February 2020, I'll be quick, the CEO didn't have a clue about blockchain and Bitcoin and all that sort of stuff. He had all the trepidation, heard all the stuff of volatility, this and all that.
Chip maker?
All that. MicroStrategy in the United States, right?
It's a chip maker or something?
Software developer, they make software for companies, right? Back in February, March 2020, all the trepidation. By August 2020, they had invested in a Bitcoin strategy. By August this year, their shares were higher than Google and Apple. By August this year, they had made a 101% profit on their investment. My simple point is this. I see the adoption, and I know you guys at the Hill, some of you, not you, but many of the others are not really looking at these issues. I believe that like, what I call the MicroStrategy model could be adopted by a country like Barbados, given that economists at UE had said back in 2015 that if Barbados had put a little bit of their investment in Bitcoin when it was $353, when it reached $69,000 in November last year, just think about all these zeros that could have been made and where that money could have been used to fund the health sector and to get people who have cataract seeing again. I'm simply suggesting this, Professor. I know you're one of the few luminaries up there on the Hill who I listen to, many of us listen to. But the point is this, simply, we have opportunities to do other things, to make money, to grow economies in Barbados, and to put money in young people's pockets. But the folk at the Hill and the politicians, they're not looking at it. So until they start looking at it, there isn't going to be any education of my friend, the saxophonist, who can then learn how to make money from an NFT with his brilliant work.
No, thanks for that. And I certainly, I think it fits with where I tried to go, that we need these new growth catalysts. Digitization is one, there's money out there. And again, I come back to the point, that's one of the advantages, few as if they may be, of being in opposition, in that you actually have the time to reflect, build up your knowledge, expertise on all of these different options and these different areas, that you can then come with a new, well thought out agenda as to where you would like to take the country. I got to take one from Motley. I ain't see he so long. Right, the online, but I can't deny my man here.
What really bothers me from off the road, right? To see that we have poured so much money in the last 4 years, but I am not seeing no direct economic activity generated from what we have drawn down, what we have gotten from the not only from the International Monetary Fund, from the IADB, the World Bank, down from the actually streets. Nothing is happening. And one of the things that really bothers me, I have not yet seen a country that has default on its foreign debt and entered the IMF hand that later down the road it has not devalued its currency. And I have not heard anybody, none of the the intellectuals in Barbados, unless they're frightened to all want, they are not trying to scare the society, but there's a reality. Can you give me
Well, no, but okay, but also, I think the story on the debt is a little more complicated because I want to make 2 points on the debt. I think one, it's not clear to me when I look at the numbers that we are borrowing any unusual amounts compared to previous times. I think one of the things that's happening is that because so much of our borrowing has switched to foreign borrowing, that when we do the foreign borrowing, it makes the news. So we are more aware of it. But when the government borrows by issuing bonds from the central bank, that was never something that was reported in the press. I think we have to, I think it's always very important that we are guided by the facts. And the other factor is what gets reported is the total amount borrowed. What doesn't get reported is the amount of debt that gets paid down. Because loans come due and they get paid. So when you look at the net amount of borrowing, it's like we actually not in an unusual, it is not an unusual level of debt buildup. I think that's an argument I hear a lot. But when I go through the numbers, it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up that we are having an unusual amount of borrowing. We are more aware of it because it is foreign borrowing that makes the news as distinct from central bank issues. And also there's tremendous pay down of debt that has happened as well. So when you look at the net, I don't think the facts support that. But there's still the debate, okay, what you have, what are the priorities in terms of how that is spent? And I think there's a lot of fertile ground for debate around that. You know, what you have is that being directed to the correct priority areas. And I think that's where political parties should be on very good ground to debate. I think you have to be careful starting a debate from a premise about the level of borrowing, which the facts might not support you on, because then you lose credibility. Because if you go forth with an argument that, okay, the government is borrowing at a level never before, but when you drill down and you look at the amounts and so on, then you can get called out on that very easily. So if you're going to build an argument, and I don't think the facts are there to support that, but there's a lot of fertile ground to debate on how that money is being spent.
So we're gonna just do a pause to end the feed, and then we're gonna continue with some questions after.
Okay.
I just want to do the vote of thanks at the moment. Professor, thank you so much for sharing with us today, and we want to thank our online audience for participating today. We look forward to our future Astor B. Watt lectures, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.